PowerPlayChess, brought to you in association with Kagi. I'm looking at the game between Gukesh Dommaraju and Mendonca from round 9 of the Tata Steel Masters. This was another incredibly complex game. Absolutely fascinating and features one of my favourite openings, the Spanish. So going into this round, Gukesh, Pragnananda and Abdutatorov shared the lead. So it's incredibly tight at the top. Here we go. Spanish. And so far all main line, you could say. Now at the early b5 and bishop c5. So this is an ambitious continuation and highly theoretical. I mean, there are so many different ways that white can play this. a4 is a good start. Having a go at this pawn on b5, which is, advanced very early. So rook b8. So that gives white a chance to exchange and take the open file, although there are no entry points at this moment. Main continuation here, c3. But you can also take on b5. You can also take on e5, also very interesting. But Gukesh just plays the modest d3, and I think that's very clever. The other lines are much more well known. They can be very forcing. There's lots of theory. There are comparatively few games with d3, but it's a normal move, kind of way that Carlsen often likes to play. And already you can see that Mendonca thought for 6.5 minutes over d6. So yeah, he's unsettled a little bit. Bishop g5, there we go. My favourite strategy in these kind of positions. This pin, very annoying when this bishop is outside the pawn chain. Can't get back to e7 to block. So h6 and bishop h4 and g5. So Mendonca basically breaks this pin very early, very quickly. But as we've seen before, this can lead to problems for black later on because, it opens up the king side. But at the moment it's pretty closed. How is white going to break through there? c3. Okay, covers some important squares and perhaps prepares d4. So Mendonca preempts that with bishop b6. Now, the traditional maneuver here for white is to play knight d2 and rook e1 and then bounce the knight via f1 to e3, where it looks for those two important outposts. See, this is the weak square that white needs to get to. But Gukesh didn't play knight d2. He played knight a3 instead. But that's very logical. This knight can often come round to e3 via c2, and you don't need to play rook e1. In fact, the rook can be very useful on the f-file. So yes, if b4, then the knight just comes into c4. And Mendonca played well. He played knight e7. As we've seen many times in the Gioco Piano and in the Spanish, this knight often stands very well on g6. And in this particular position, it makes a lot of sense. You want to pack the king side. Otherwise, if there aren't pieces there, the weakness of h6 and g5 could become apparent. So both sides have manoeuvred a knight. So this knight gets to the dream square on e3, looking at the outposts. And although there's no immediate threat to move into f5, Mendonca had a big think here and decided, right, I've had enough. I'm just going to get rid of that knight straight away. Now, there are pros and cons to that. In some ways, it gives black more security on the king side. But you do lose that dot-squared bishop. king g7. I mean, black is pretty solid at the moment here, and it might even be possible to gain the initiative on the king side. Bishop c2 from Gukesh. It's interesting, he really wants to sort of hold the tension here. He could have exchanged on b5 first. And this is a fascinating position. So I'm going to stop and have a slurp of tea. You have a think, I'll have a drink. How would you play as black in this position? Black to play. What would you do? Okay, cheers. Well, Mendonca thought for 22 minutes here and played c5, which is very often what you want to do. You want to try and cramp white's centre and gain a bit of ground in the centre for black. But this is a very interesting move. The computer likes this move. It's not a very human move, it has to be said, because it damages black's pawn structure. But okay, the first basic point is that the b2 pawn is attacked. So if rook takes b2, and black should be okay there. Okay, so what about simply defending this pawn? You know, what about queen c1? Well, I mean, it's not very nice for the queen to have to defend this pawn, but then again, if white can simply take here, then white has a structural advantage. But at this moment, black can advance on the king side. Now that the queen is a little further away. As white, I would love to play the knight to h4. But there's a problem with that. Knight takes e4. Of course, pawn takes knight, knight takes knight. Okay, but it's not over. What about knight takes g6? But then knight takes bishop, threatening knight e2 check. Very unfortunate position for the queen on c1. And after pawn takes, well, black is obviously doing fine in that position. Is at the moment actually 2 pawns up, but okay, it'll be 1, but black is fine. And after g4, what about knight d2? Well, after h5, black has quite a nice initiative on the king side. You know, these pieces don't look too good. So b takes a4, I think, would have been a very interesting continuation. Well done if you played that inhuman move. I mean, I think it's possible, for example, just to take this, as I mentioned, and play this position, and I think it's okay for white. But yeah, taking on a4 would have been a good idea. c5 instead. And now Gukesh exchanged on b5 and played b4. So he's got control of the open A file. That's important. He's fixed that pawn on b5. That could later on be a target. Exchange on b4. And now queen e7. So that's a very understandable move because it stops the rook coming into a7. But actually, bishop e6 looks like a better move. So why? Well, basically to make sense of this bishop, to give the bishop something to do, white needs to play d4. But if d4, then that bishop lands on c4, and that's a big improvement on, well, what we'll see in the game basically. But queen e7 played and rook a5, so this already looks attractive for white, and bishop d7 and d4. So a little bit of pressure here, and this opens up this diagonal as well. Bishop c6, okay, some pressure on e4. Queen a1, excellent move. That's a beautiful move, supporting the rook. You never know, it might be able to come down here, or a6. But also puts pressure on e5. And something like this is tremendous for white. Bishop is in the same line as the rook, and the queen is opposite the king. Very good for white. So rook e8 gives that pawn some protection. And now again, another really big moment in the game. And I find Gukesh's choice really interesting. We saw in the match against Ding that he loves to maintain tension and basically hopes that his opponent at some point is going to crack or back down in some way. And here he does exactly the same. He plays bishop b3. So you can see that there's pressure on f7. That's a very understandable move. But there were some really tempting alternatives. He could have plunged in on e5 and played rook a7. So again, trying to get through to f7. So rook a8, and that can lead to exchanges. But after this, knight takes e5. That's won a pawn. Now, is that enough to win? You know, it's only half a pawn. These pawns are damaged. But with two bishops, you'd think that white has pretty good chances. Of course, that's not completely forced, but I'm just showing you one kind of sample line, and there's no doubt that the rook on a7 is extremely dangerous. It's also possible to play d5. So that would push this back. And then bishop d3, just lining up pressure here. But as I said, you know, bishop b3 also a very attractive choice, and it maintains the tension. That's Gukesh's thing. And black has big choices here. You know, it's possible to take this pawn with either knight or bishop, but knight takes. This is actually too much. So let me see. Yeah, I mean, white is going to crash through here, basically. And bishop takes. Well, this is a better option. Obviously, keeping the knight on f6. Rook here. Okay, let's just push the rook up, and then rook a6. There's a lot of pressure here. So that's interesting. It's also possible to block. There's nothing clear for white. It looks unpleasant for black, but nothing clear. But Mendonca played rook a8, so he was worried about the rook coming down. And Gukesh played knight d2. So that defends this pawn. Obviously that's not possible because f7 could be taken. So rook f8, defending the pawn. And bishop c2. So that's just holding the centre, but that bishop can bounce round to d3 to attack the b5 pawn. Knight h5, okay, pushing the bishop back, and the knight hop back again. Again, I think d5 is a very tempting move. So that, you know, if bishop here, then bishop d3, putting pressure on b5. But no, Gukesh wants to maintain the tension. So just a little bit of pressure here. And it's not easy for black to find a good plan in this position. White has lots of interesting options. Mendonca kind of cracked here. He took on a5. Couldn't take the tension. And after this, I mean, this is certainly feels like an improvement for white. So potential runner down the board. And also, you know, these squares open up for white. Finally, Gukesh decides to close the position. And the rook comes back. Now, where's it going to come back to? f2 or f1? Well, f2, because he's still looking to bring that knight round to g3, looking at the dream square f5 and also h5. So Mendonca plays bishop c8. Now, as it turns out, this is too passive. It's an understandable move, looking to swing the queen across, attacking e3, and also blockading the a pawn. Very reasonable. But h5 would have been better, just to try and stir things up on the king side. Just start pushing that pawn as far as possible, basically. Because, you know, these pieces are pretty good. And now that this diagonal has been closed, there isn't the same pressure on f7 as previously. But bishop c8 played. Knight f1, very good move. So there we go. That's Mendonca's notion to attack this one. But queen a3, excellent move. Defending e3 and looking at d6. And after this, well, it's clear that Mendonca has gone completely wrong. White is just taking control here. Knight falls back, but, well, this one had to be defended. Knight g3. The dream square. Knight comes back to e7 to guard f5. And now another really nice maneuver. Do you know what? When you've got a position like this, when your opponent is passive, then it's very easy to find good moves. You know, bishop d3, well, got to be careful about that one because that could be taken. So, well, what do you want to do? You want to play bishop d1. So two ideas. Coming to this diagonal, as we've just seen. But this time the pawn is still protected. But also, you could end up going to h5 to attack the f7 pawn. So knight g8 played. I guess he's looking to block, in case of bishop h5, he's looking to block on f6. But watch out for this move. Bishop e2, there we go, hitting the pawn. Queen b7. Bishop d3. So nice and gentle. And the bishop has made room for the rook to swing across. So black is just too tied up now. Yeah, I mean, if black waits, then the rook is going to come down and, you know, very soon rook b6 and taking here, for example. But in the game, bishop d7 played. And that allowed bishop takes pawn. And Mendonca's completely collapsed. Well, short of time, stuff happens. Knight takes, queen takes. This is move 41. They've reached the time control, but black is completely lost. Queen here. Queen takes e5. Check, but that's no big deal. The rook blocks and at the same time threatens queen f6. Check, and black's position just caves in completely. Well, what a superb strategic crush from Gukesh. Actually, there are very few tactics in that game, if you noticed. But what he did do brilliantly was maintain the tension. That's his USP. You know, if you think of moves just way back here, even in this position, you know, he could have exchanged on b5, but instead bishop c2, which did allow black to take here, but he got away with it because it's kind of a counterintuitive move. And then later on, playing moves like bishop b3. You know, many of us would be tempted to close the position, just shutting off the attack on e4, and that's still better for white. But bishop b3 posed more problems for black, and Mendonca just couldn't stand the strain in the end and collapsed. Brilliant game from Gukesh, and with that win, he takes the sole lead, 6.5 out of 9. Abdusattorov drew with Caruana today, and he has 6. And Fedoseev has 6 points. He defeated Hari Krishna. So Gukesh 6.5, Abdusattorov, Fedoseev 6. Praggnanandhaa lost to Giri and has 5.5. Giri with that win reaches 50%. He has 4.5. Well, still 4 rounds to go. You never know. He might still feature at the top. But no, I mean, those top 4 players, Gukesh, Abdusattorov, Fedoseev and Praggnanandhaa, still look like they are the contenders for first place with 4 rounds to go.